Hi, welcome to another episode of Concord Days. My name is Richard Smith. I am a Concord historian and writer, and I am joined today as my co-host by Phil Lepshevitz. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Richard. Nice to see you. And again, I'm Phil Lepshevitz of Minuteman Media Network, and I'd like to introduce our guest this week, who is from the National Park Service. Margie Brown is the Natural and Cultural Resources Manager. Hi, Margie. Nice to see you.
Hi, Phil. Hi, Richard.
Certainly glad to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. So your official title again is what?
I'm the Natural and Cultural Resources Program Manager for Minuteman National Historical Park.
So tell us what you do.
Well, so the park spans 3 towns and covers about 1,000 acres. We have about 50 buildings and a lot of maintained landscapes, gardens, pastures. So mostly I focus on ensuring the ecological health of the park and then making sure that all of our built and historical resources, including our archives, are in good condition.
So I think that a lot of people who come to Minuteman National Park, I think they think of Minuteman as being basically the North Bridge and then the visitor center in Lexington. And sometimes they're unaware that there are a lot of buildings and land in between those 2 landmarks. How many historic buildings are there in the park?
Well, so we have about 50 buildings. About 30 of them are listed on the National Register, and a dozen of them are termed witness houses. And so those were present at the time of the battle on April 19th, 1775. And so, of course, those are our highest priority. Examples would be the Hartwell Tavern, the Smith House, the Wayside, in an earlier version, was a witness house, the Elisha Jones House, which overlooks the North Bridge, and Major John Buttrick House up on Liberty Street. One of the most exciting additions to the park is the Barrett House on Barrett's Mill Road, and that was added to the park about 10 years ago.
Now, so the Barrett House, of course, is where Colonel James Barrett lived. And we know for a fact that there were a lot of weapons and munitions and things being hidden there by Colonel Barrett prior to April 19th. How did the park go about getting that house? Because when I moved to Concord, it was a private residence.
Yes, so it's a really fascinating history. So the Barrett family occupied the house up into the early 1900s. And I believe it was 1905, it passed to the McGrath family. And the McGrath family held it for 100 years, knowing that it was a highly significant structure. It was actually purchased by a nonprofit, Save Our Heritage Incorporated, and the building underwent a complete restoration and then passed to the Park Service in, I believe it was 2009.
Yeah, and if you've ever gone down Barrett's Mill Road, you can't miss it. And I remember when they were restoring the house, they did it using 18th century techniques, if I'm not mistaken. So it was all done with manual labor, done by hand, hand-wrought nails and everything like that. Now, was that purposely done by the park, or was it kind of decided on between Save Our Heritage and the park to do it in that way so that it looked like the 18th century?
Well, so the National Park Service is under the Department of the Interior, and the larger Department of the Interior issues guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. And there's several different standards. So you can preserve a historic structure, or you can rehabilitate a structure, which sort of opens it up a bit, makes it more available for compatible uses. Or you can do a full restoration, And that was the chosen treatment method adopted by Save Our Heritage. So you could say that the National Park Service was involved, but it was really the sort of our federal standards for how we restore historic properties. And this is all guided by the National Historic Preservation Act. So it was done, they fully documented the house. They prepared a historic structures report. So decisions were worked out in advance of actually taking the house apart. They knew what they intended to do. And then when they were doing the work, they were very carefully documenting it and produced what's called a completion report. So we really have a nice record of the whole process.
So I guess basically the Department of the Interior kind of guides anything that you can or want to do within the boundaries of the park.
Yes, but those standards can be adopted really by any individual, anyone who has a historic house who's wondering, oh, well, what should I do? How would I choose my paint color? What do I do with my windows? These are all guidelines that can be applied to any property, including someone's individual choice to list their property on the National Register if it's highly significant.
Which, of course, we have a lot of those in Concord.
Yes. Very, very special. And that sort of patina of authenticity is what lends Concord so much charm and appeal. You come here and you really feel like you're stepping back in time. And, you see the film crews rolling through town because they know they can come to Concord and get that sense of history and authenticity.
So you said at the beginning that there's about 1,000 acres within Minuteman Park. Of course, most of that is there are wetlands, there are wooded areas, there are meadows. Obviously, with your position, you're in charge of those things as well, correct?
I am, and I really had no idea what I was getting into when I started working here 5 years ago. And I mean, I grew up in Lincoln. I went to high school in Concord. So I felt like I really knew this place, but I had no knowledge really, because there are just so many layers of history, so many natural features in this park. And so I like to think of it as this transect of history, because we start in Lexington near Route 95, and the park extends westward to the Barrett's farm. And so that's a distance of about 7 miles. And it being a linear park, it's almost like a transect. And at the Lexington end of the park, we have a fault, a geological fault. And so the stones there are something like 300 billion years old. I can't remember, but it's just, there's an uplift. And you're seeing it when there's some power lines that go along it's called the Bloody Bluff Fault. And it's an uplifting between two terrains. And so from that point, you're basically going downhill until you get to the Concord River floodplains. And then, we've got the Sudbury and the Assabet. The confluence is just above parkland, but that amazing river is flowing northward, and just very fertile soils. I mean, you understand why the colonists were so enthusiastic to come to Concord in 1635 and displaced a very large population of Musketaquid Indians who had settled in this very fertile area.
So when you got the job, were you aware that you had to be a historian and a geologist and an environmentalist? And
And every day I learn something new, and anytime I'm learning something, it just all seems so relevant to Minuteman. I think we just offer so much to so many people, and people love to come to the park. Obviously, it's been a very popular destination during the whole COVID pandemic because of the amount of space, the trails, and just the beauty. I mean, there's nothing better than getting some fresh air on the North Bridge.
Well, my favorite part of Minuteman is actually down by Hartwell Tavern, over by the Bloody Angle. That walk down there in the fall is absolutely amazing. Yeah. Absolutely amazing.
Now, did you see our sheep that were grazing down there this past fall?
I saw that. And I was going to ask you about that. So when I was a ranger at Minuteman in 1999 and 2000, there were way more trees in the park than there are now. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more open land in the park than there was in 1999. Maybe talk a little bit about opening up the land and the use of sheep and cattle and animals like that in preserving the land. Because I know when the park started to cut down a lot of trees, there were a lot of people in the area that were pretty upset about that. But I know that a lot of national parks like Gettysburg is trying to make Gettysburg look like 1863. Things like that. So is Minuteman, have they been trying to make the landscape look more like 1775 than it used to?
That's exactly why many trees were removed. So back in the colonial period, we had about 90% open land and 10% forested or woodlot land. And so by the early 1990s, we had just the opposite in the park. Most of the land had reverted to woods. And so you really couldn't interpret the story of the British coming out and retreating along this battle road, because what they experienced is they were walking by farms and grazing animals and orchards. So there was a major effort both to improve pedestrian circulation along the linear corridor. Once it became apparent that Route 2A was not going to be closed, there was an effort to create the Battle Road Trail and then to restore the landscapes along that corridor. So a lot of that clearing predated my arrival. I've only been here 5 years, but what we're seeing is that without grazing animals or routine haying, we're losing some of those fields. And so much of my work is to encourage and sustain or bring back the working landscape, and I like to call it active agriculture. So getting our fields mowed, bringing back the livestock. So we did have a herd of sheep right by the Hartwell Tavern. They were moving around. They move about every week, and so they'll move around an area, and then but we brought them to the Hartwell Tavern area where there's really nice grazing, and we've reestablished an orchard there. So I think it's kind of a hidden surprise for people who are walking along the Battle Road Trail, like, whoa, look at these sheep.
Are these any special kind of sheep, or are they just everyday average sheep?
They're very special sheep. So all of our active agriculture is through special use permits with farmers, be they private or nonprofit farmers. And so the sheep are miniature sheep. They're very easy to handle. Their breed is Ouessant, and the Ouessant sheep breeder lives in Lincoln. Her name's Karen Sayo, and her farm is Breton Meadow Farm. And so the sheep are only 20 inches tall, and they weigh about 50 to 60 pounds. So you can kind of pick them up, like put them under your arm and say, okay, guys, time to move on. And of course, they love to be moved because they know there's going to be good grazing. So we've had Girl Scout troops come and pick up the portable fencing. You know, they'll each be on a post and they move the fencing to the new area. They've named all the sheep.
Of course.
Really sweet. And then we have volunteers that come to the park every day to check in on the sheep, make sure they're doing okay. Right now they're at the Carty barn so that they have some protection in the winter. It's really unnerving to hear the coyotes at night, but the sheep are protected with an electric fence. It's solar charged in the summer, and then in the winter it's plugged into the barn. And the coyotes, they actually sense that electric charge and they just don't want to have anything to do with it. So we've had the sheep in the park for 2.5 years and no problems. So.
And I also know that if you go down Route 2A, sometimes in the summertime, you'll see a herd of cattle in the park as well.
Yeah, so the cattle came to the park about 20 years ago through the farm school in Athol. And I think at one time we had about 20 heirloom cattle in the park. We are transitioning to a new herd. They, you know, because they're aged and some of them have passed. So in the months ahead, Codman Community Farm will be introducing some young cattle to those fields.
And these, they're the type of cattle, you said heirloom cattle, so they're the type of cattle that you would have seen in Concord in 1775, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So I think I went out to the farm school. It's actually quite a ways, so I can see why, you know, they're not continuing here. But so Randall Limebrack is a breed that was started up in Vermont. Of course, the Scottish Highlanders with the big shaggy hair and big horns came over from Scotland. And so the great thing about the heirloom cattle is they can really subsist on rough pasture. And the Scottish Highlanders will just put their nose right down in through the snow to see what they can forage on. That being said, you know, the farmer would bring them hay during the winter months and grain. And that's the case with the sheep too. The sheep are on a daily allotment of hay and grain until they can get back out to graze and, you know, get to work, because the livestock, you know, ideally they graze on a mix of grasses and forbs, but also knock back some of our invasive plants.
Now, so I know that the park for many years, speaking of invasive plants, has been doing whatever it can to get rid of invasive species. That seems to be a never-ending job, doesn't it?
It is, yes. And it's really, I had a quote for you on that. The only thing that will redeem mankind is cooperation. And that certainly has to do with it's like all hands on deck for invasives. And if you've ever grown vegetables, you know, you have to go out and weed them every week. Some people get out there every day, but there's no rest when it comes to invasives. And I think the magnitude of the invasive plant issues and the fallout being the loss of biodiversity, it's a real priority issue for the park, but it's very challenging with so much acreage. So we have volunteers going out every week when the temperatures are over 40 degrees. And, you know, our priorities are bittersweet, which gets up into the trees and can pull trees over. There's another vine that's really becoming a problem. It's a porcelain berry vine. And it's similar, it just climbs the trees and smothers them within like 2 seasons. So it's almost like a kudzu vine. It's very aggressive. So those are two of our higher priorities. And then black swallowwort is in the milkweed family, but it's toxic to butterflies and very challenging to remove from the landscape. But we love our butterflies, and we do want to try and get rid of these non-native, very invasive plants to protect the park's biodiversity.
So how much of a hindrance has the pandemic been with doing these kind of things within the park, you know, working on the landscape and having volunteers come in? I mean, how badly has the park been affected by the pandemic?
Oh, that's a great question. So, you know, of course, we all took a big pause in March and April of 2020. And then we started to kind of think more strategically, well, what can we do? And so every step of the way, we had sort of a COVID plan. You know, what can the parks do? What can't they do? For example, we had a tree contractor. Well, is it safe to have the tree contractor work in the park? You know, we sort of thought it through, and you know, you just have to think about how can we do this in accordance with the CDC guidelines. We just took a very phased, incremental approach, and by summer, we did have a crew working. I think everyone was so glad to come and work outside, and you know, camaraderie. I still, like when we do a volunteer event, we are all just so happy to be together. I never realized, I think of myself as an introvert, but when I see people, I realize, no, I really like to be with other people. And so I think that working together to manage invasive plants, it's hard work, but it's also very gratifying. And one of our most dedicated volunteers is my dad. He's 90, he lives in Concord, and he loves to be outdoors. And so, you know, to be able to help the park and have a place, you know, to get out every day, he's cleared a lot of bittersweet off of the park stone walls. So shout out to my dad.
Somebody's got to do it.
Anybody, please.
You know, one of the things I'd like to ask is, you know, as you explain all these things, you know, people again think of one day, April 19th, 1775, but of course, 1,000 acres, 50 some odd buildings, and a small staff. So how do you manage all these different things that you're doing? Again, okay, you say volunteers, but I know that in the past, there has been the opportunity to work with other groups, whether they're in the community of Concord or even beyond. AmeriCorps people have been here. So a lot of what your time is spent is coordinating these groups to do all this work. Am I correct?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because, you know, Richard, you know, you're reflecting back 20 years ago and seeing how much has changed, or, you know, the landscape reverting. We're constantly asking ourselves, are we doing something that's sustainable? You know, should we be reducing some of our maintained assets? And so service-wide across the Park Service, we are asking these bigger questions. What are our priorities? How can we reduce our maintenance workload? And who can we partner with? You know, these farmers are in many ways assisting us with a lot of our most challenging maintenance areas. Maintaining along fences is incredibly laborious, but if you're doing it in conjunction with livestock, then there's an incentive. So that's sort of what we're looking towards now, is to think strategically. We apply for grants, and the Park Service does issue grants. So, you know, we're hoping that we'll get some additional grant funding. When those fields were cleared, it was part of a nationwide economic recovery program. So, and oh yeah, so here's my quote. If you're walking down the right path and you're willing to keep walking, eventually you'll make progress. That's by
Nice.
Barack Obama. So that's,
Nice.
we just keep going, try to keep going in the right direction. And the garden, at the Buttrick Garden is a good example. It was overrun with the invasive plants, but we just keep plugging away at it. And just as the sort of invasive plants cause exponential damage if they grow unchecked, as soon as you make an intervention, you've made the next visit exponentially easier. And so we just have to think of it as, as Obama says, as moving in the right direction, or putting ourselves on a trajectory and just trying to stay the course.
One of the other things that, I really have appreciated about the park is how it's a laboratory. It's a living laboratory. So for example, I know that there's been some structural restoration, and there has been a branch of the Park Service that has come, and yet the help that they get are people in programs to learn carpentry and skills. But I also know universities, besides the obvious looking at historical events, but they also look to the park for other opportunities in other fields.
Yeah, so Park Service is really proactive in recruiting people to learn the trades of historic preservation. And so we have cooperative agreements with both groups like AmeriCorps, but also with universities, and a lot of internship opportunities. And so that's what I do all summer, is manage interns. But even I've had students from local universities, virtually now we're doing internships. And we are such a great laboratory. We provide so many very interesting problems for them to work on, or research projects. So that kind of keeps us up to date, often technologically. An example would be the Parker's Revenge Archaeology Project, which used new technology to discover historic materials. And right now we have an undergrad student helping us with another archaeological study, just kind of scoping the framework for the project.
And of course, the Parker's Revenge Project, I think what made that a very unique project was that was a project that was brought in from the outside. Wasn't a Park Service generated, we want to look here because of something. There was interest in the community, and the community had a lot to do with driving that project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was an unanswered question. Where was the battle? Are we interpreting this incorrectly? And it was being interpreted incorrectly until the research team found the physical evidence of the musket balls, and then they understood exactly where the British stood, where the Lexington militia stood. And there are just so many takeaways from that story. It's one of our most popular destinations now for people to learn about the history of the American Revolution.
And for years and years and years, that area was really a kind of a wild, tangled mess of brushes and bushes, and you could barely even see it.
Yeah.
So now, like you said, it's one of the most popular areas in the park.
Yep, it really is. And, so of course we brought the sheep there. Got to have them,
the hardest working sheep in Concord.
Tabitha's pasture. So yeah, we made sure when we reseeded, after they cleaned out all the invasives there, we made sure to reseed it with a pasture mix. And the sheep, you swear they're saying, can we go back to Tabitha's pasture? We love that orchard grass.
So I know
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
Go ahead. Oh, well, okay, thank you. Well, you know, I know we try not to put things in the date happenings here at the park, but I do know that in a few more years, there's going to be another big anniversary coming up. And is there any little sneak peek on what's going to be happening at the park, maybe?
Well, a lot. But, you know, here we are trying to, you know, be sustainable and not overextend ourselves. So it's creeping up, you know, here we are, 2021. So we are hoping to rehab all of our witness houses, get them back into good condition. We're hoping to rehab the trail and the boardwalks along the trail, get those into good condition. But also the Barrett House, get that open in some manner that's sustainable, because that is where the British were headed on that day. And so that would be a real important place for us to showcase in 2025. Of course, the North Bridge is always the hub of any celebration. Gerald Ford was here for the 200th anniversary and spoke at the bridge. So we will be very busy, and it's exciting. I mean, that was a big draw for me to come to the park for what is probably the last chapter of my Park Service career, but to be here when we're celebrating the 250th is just a lot to look forward to.
And we can't really talk about the park without mentioning my favorite place in the park, which was the Wayside, which is where I worked primarily when I was a ranger at the park. Maybe talk a little bit about the Wayside so people know exactly what it is and where it is.
Yeah, so the Wayside, home of authors, was occupied by the Alcott family, Nathaniel Hawthorne and his family, and then the Lothrop family. So 3 generations of authors in this beautiful house and the nearby barn. Both of them are considered witness structures, although it was a much more diminutive house in 1775. So one of the nicest exhibits, I think, if you are able to go into the barn, is a model that shows how the house was expanded by each successive owner. As you know, the site was hit by a tornado in 2016, and that really ravaged the landscape, and we're still kind of cleaning up from that. It destabilized hundreds of trees on the ridge above the house. And so that's been a focus area for me to, you know, unfortunately remove a lot of trees from the site because they just weren't stable, but also to do some replanting there. What's cool about the house, and it will of course open again after COVID, but there are so many furnishings in that house. And so that is one of the more special destinations within the park because you actually get to see some of the physical fabric associated with the occupants of that house.
Definitely.
Is that what you liked? Was the actual, because the house is so fun inside.
I loved working at the Wayside. It was one of my favorite places to be. You know, the Alcotts were there when they were little girls. So what I always said was Little Women was written at Orchard House, but it happened at the Wayside.
There you go.
And so a lot of people liked hearing those stories. Of course, you know, Hawthorne's Sky Parlor is pretty amazing. I always enjoyed taking people up to that. You know, climbing, it's like climbing a ship when you're going up those stairs. So yeah, we're hoping that by the end of COVID, the Wayside will be open again with all the other historic places in Concord as well.
Yeah.
So before we go, is there anything that you would like people to know about the park or anything you'd like to tell people about the park? Even though COVID is currently going on, I'm assuming that people are more than welcome to come and explore the landscape.
Yeah, so I thought sort of the secret I would let everybody in on that are they're still haven't fallen asleep yet, is that still present in the park are all of the intersecting, what they're called bridal ways. So you can walk on the Battle Road Trail, but if you have a historical map, there were many secondary roads that headed off from the main road and went to the towns. So for example, the site of Harker's Revenge, there's a bridal way that we now use as part of the interpretive trail, but it would have been kind of a back way to Lexington Center. There was another one to Bedford. And so if you were on horseback, you didn't need to travel on the main road. You could take all these secondary bridle ways, very English. They went along people's stone walls. And so during the, since we've all been sheltering and what am I going to do this weekend? Oh, I think I'll go for a walk. So I've been finding all these fragments of the old bridle ways that go between Lincoln and Concord. And they're so cool because you really just feel like you're back in time. There's a big old stone wall, either on one side or both sides. And so the one that I think is really cool is it heads south from the Paul Revere capture site. And it actually intersects the Lincoln dump, but it kind of goes to the side of it. And then it picks up again. And then, of course, there's Route 2, but then it picks up again in Lincoln near Wheeler Road. And it's just so cool to have these little fragments of basically untouched history that all either lead to or from the park.
So the visitor centers and the historic houses are not open, but the park is definitely open.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And there's just so much to explore. And we do have secondary trails to Vernal Pool and behind this Hartwell Tavern. What we will do in April is we'll probably set up a tent right outside the visitor center. This is what we did last year. And so people can, if they have questions, they can talk to a ranger. We did the same at the Minuteman Visitor Center in Lexington, and people were allowed to go into the building to view the exhibits. Our interpretive staff are working on an amazing virtual program for the April events. And so if you haven't been to the park's website, and I know some of our favorite pictures came from Phil Lebshevitz, but it's just, there's a lot going on the park website that's really interesting and well done. So I highly recommend seeing some of our virtual programs.
And what is the park website?
www.nps.gov and then /MIMA, which is Minute Man. So.
And we will put that on the comments section below when this airs sometime in the near future. So, okay. Margie Brown, thank you so much today for visiting with us. This was an amazing talk. I learned a lot of new things that I never knew about MIMA, and we are really happy to have you here today.
It was nice to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And Phil, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for everyone who joined in and watched. And this has been another episode of Concord Days. Thanks for watching.